website for Abu Unity at abunityfoundation.org. We're also joined by Ashna Khanna. Ashna is the Legislative Director for the ACLU of Virginia. She oversees Virginia's legislative and policy programs by coordinating and collaborating with staff to plan and implement effective integrated advocacy policy initiatives. Prior to coming to Virginia, Ashna did writing and theater workshops in prisons, fought for safe drinking water for the children of Flint, Michigan, and worked with the sheriffs across the state to gather and analyze data to shed light on bail reform. As a trained facilitator, Ashna continues to engage in dialogues about anti-Blackness, culture, and choice points within institutions. She is excited to continue to work alongside community members and to push for racially just policies and reforms. And the ACLUVA.org is how you can connect with Ashna and her work at the ACLU. Next, I'm introducing Chelsea Higgs Wise. She's a mom, a clinical social worker, and consultant who specializes in strategic planning with an equity lens. She's a radio host on WRIR-LP, and that's 97.3 FM, and where her show, Race Capital, airs every Wednesday at 10 a.m. You hear that? Every Wednesday at 10 a.m., you can listen on 97.3 FM, Race Capital. Chelsea took her experience and network and co-founded the nonprofit organization Marijuana Justice in 2019. Marijuana Justice focuses on advancing attitudes to make the use, the sale, growth, enforcement, and reinvestment of marijuana equitable for all. And you can connect with that work at marijuanajustice.org. And I know we've already heard an introduction of Lorraine Wright, but there's just a little more I want to say. She's a native of New York. She's the executive director of I Vote for Me. It's a community-based grassroots organization in Richmond. I Vote for Me focuses on self-advocacy in the spaces of social justice and the protection of human rights. I Vote for Me sits on the coordinating committee and is an organizational member of the National Dignity in Schools campaign. The coalition focused on ending preschool to prison pipeline. Lorraine is committed to being an agent of change in any and every space she's in. Lastly, and most importantly, she is the parent of two amazingly awesome children, emphasis added, who even if they don't yet realize it, are on the path to becoming conscientious freedom fighters, just like their mother. And you can connect with Dignity in Schools at dignityinschools.org. And when Lorraine takes over that, the audience portion of the question and answers, I'm going to give her the opportunity to let you know how to get in touch with her organization, I Vote for Me. All right, Kofi, I'm going to toss it back to you.
All right, thank you. So we're just gonna jump right in. I kind of wanted to ask a question to all of the panelists, just kind of throw out a couple questions for everyone starting out. This feels different. You know, we've seen a lot of protests in the past. We've seen, you know, even riots in the past. Unfortunately, this seems to be a pretty regular occurrence every couple months, every couple years, you know, or we have something like this. But you know, it's been said before that this seems a lot more widespread. And so I wanted to just kind of toss a question up to the panel as to why do you think that is?
Well, am I on?
Yes,
yeah.
We can hear you.
First of all, the last video, Mr. Floyd, was really dramatic. I think it changed many people's perspectives who were sitting on the fence, wondering whether Black folk and other people of color were really telling the truth and whether they were being accurate in terms of police actions. And our society typically defers to the police when it comes to those encounters. But this particular incident was so vivid and so obviously against any norms of any sane person in terms of protecting the public, that I think it shook the conscience of the nation. And really, even those middle of the ground, mostly law enforcement supporters, almost every situation, really began to doubt and question their beliefs and their trust and the whole conversation about officers being always right.
That's good. If I could add to that, I think the other part, me being an ex-police officer, is the direct disregard for personnel with that professional background, especially when it comes to healthcare, advising the officers of this condition that he was cannot breathe and he's going to lose consciousness. I think that kind of led to it as a direct disregard for even the experts or people who have in those fields on the scene, kind of added to it and showed a direct disregard for life as well.
If I might add, I think I certainly agree with both of those. I would also think that, you know, when you take a look at the protest as a result of this killing, as Kofi, you mentioned, it's not, this killing was the spark, right? People are coming out and protesting against systemic injustice and systemic racism. And I think that prior to this, even though we had videos, it was still easy for a large percentage of this country to think that there was not systemic race issues, or there was not systemic institutionalized inequality, and they could pass it off as a one-off here and there. But I actually think maybe it's just because I've run for office, I take a political lens on this. But when you take a look at the man who we have in the White House, who is the walking embodiment of supremacy, the walking embodiment of systemic injustice, and you see that man in office and you see how many people in this country voted for him, it's very, very difficult in that environment to turn away and really think that this was a one-off. I think his election and what he's done over the last 3 years, it really made people open their eyes to the fact that there is systemic racism in this country, there is systemic inequality, and the man in the White House is the perfect embodiment of that.
Yeah, I'd also like to comment on this. I think a big difference in this situation is that we have gotten really used to seeing police officers shoot us. Now, shooting is quick, it's fast. You have to slow down the video to watch it, right? This is a different experience of literally, it's almost like the human experience of being Black, of being suffocated, unheard all the way until your death, right? And we had to watch that on camera, watch people begging for his life, but the authority was on his neck, so it didn't matter, it didn't move, much like our policy. I mean, this was a different type of experience this video took us through with police power that is not normally on a video that we're used to seeing. So I think it's much more the use of force here that encapsulates bigger than just a lethal weapon of a quick shooting.
And just to piggyback off what everyone else is speaking on, and when you think about what Steve mentioned and what Chelsea mentioned and what Alan mentioned, and you think about the centuries and the decades and the years and the generations we've been enduring and fighting the same fight over and over again without any resolve, without any resolution. Let's not even talk about reparations, but it's like the pressure just bust the pipes with this particular incident, because it took 8 minutes for this human life to leave his body. 8 minutes. That was a slow, agonizing death. We heard him call for his mother. We heard him cry out in pain. That is something that will trigger the average human with empathy and compassion. So I think with the brutality of it, the slowness of it, along with the tensions, the racial tensions we already have in this country, that was the light, the flame that sparked and exploded this whole situation.
And hey, Valerie, look, I know I'm still not a panelist in this traditional sense, and I'm kind of leading with the Facebook portion, but let me just add one more thing. There was also an element that we really can't overlook, and that's the cavalier nature of the posing on this man's body. And so we can't escape that, and we can't go past that, because it wasn't just this arbitrary spark, it was the cavalier nature of, this is my trophy, I'm posing with it, what you gonna do about it?
With your hands in your pockets, chilling on my neck.
I agree.
Yeah, I think another thing to add to that.
400 years.
Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for
I
that,
think-
Lorraine.
I think another part to add to that is that with respect to why you also have such a widespread of officers who say, I do not side with this whatsoever, is exactly because of the fact of the heinous of the actions of this officer. You have a widespread officer who have vocalized their discontent with what took place. And that's the difference, I think, is what's making this a little bit different than times before. There's a national cry from officers who was like, we don't side with that, we don't partner with that, and that is not who we want to be represented by. So
Right.
And if I may just add, I just want to say, also, we will not end until there's real accountability. There has been a lack of accountability, and there has been a lack of justice. And right now, symbolism is not going to work. We want real policies, we want real action, and there's going to be real accountability. And the way this is going to be different is that we're going to keep going for it, on the state level, the local level, the national level, and community engagement and working with the Black community needs to be step one. That needs to be step one, not step 10, not step never. It needs to be done intentionally, it needs to be done inclusively, and it needs to be done equitably.
yeah.
It is long past due.
That's right. That's right. Let's move on. So what does this mean in the broader context of current events? We've heard a little bit about the White House. We've heard a little bit about what's going on there, but, we really are in a moment. We're in a moment, right, where we better do something because the American people, and Black Americans, absolutely, but the American people, we're tired. We will not sit idly by. I've heard, some of you share, police officers are not siding with this. We have all kinds of officials coming forward and saying, this isn't right. So the American people are tired. But we have, someone sitting in the White House right now that is attempting to talk about the use of force as ways to even take over where governors are unwilling to come out against protesters. What now? What now? And if I might add to that, I'm going to throw a little more on that because something else has been surfacing. I watched just a few moments of an incredibly disturbing video where there was a woman who was talking about all of George Floyd's previous charges, talked about his criminal history as if this 8 minutes had anything to do with it. So what is your response to folks who go there? What is your response? And this is open to all.
I want to just start by saying that I think that a lot of it, in anything, I'm a pastor, so anything that we do, I always say the motive behind why I would do something is everything. And I think you're talking about this young lady that spoke out, and I began to do my research and homework, and a lot of that is fueled by hatred and discontent with things that have gone on in her personal life. Without going into detail, you can read the history of her life. And I think a lot of, and it's also her bias that plays in that because of the things that took place in her life that has brought her to this point. Because it wasn't too long ago, but when she was on the other side of the coin, and then it also fuels him to show just the heart of our president as well, especially with his motives in military reinforcement and attacking brutally peaceful protesters. In this time as people are trying to give voice to their discontent with what's going on in our nation.
So
anyone else add to that? No.
Oh, I'm sorry. Does anyone else have anything they wanted to add to that? So the way we like to structure the discussion is to kind of go through kind of like the full arc of policing, right? So everywhere from like the intake process to the training to the transparency, and then finally to the accountability. So if we will, we'd like to maybe talk a little bit about what that recruiting intake process is. Like, how do we get better police officers in the first place? All right. So I'll toss this question up to Chelsea and Alan. You know, a lot of times we hear like there's just one bad apple excuse, right? It's just this one guy. It's just but if we keep seeing the same thing happening over and over, then clearly it's not just that one guy, right? So what are some of the ways that we could address that? And first of all, and how do we dispel with that excuse about this one bad apple? Because you never hear, you don't allow one bad apple to be a pilot, right? Because you understand there's a risk. There's no one bad apple that's a heart surgeon. If there's a bad apple, he's done, right? He or she is done. But some reason it's allowed to perpetuate when it comes to policing, and how do we prevent them from getting into the system in the first place?
Well, first of all, the police culture and the police, the perception of people about law enforcement in our country is profoundly negative, especially with people of color. There's no longer any significant trust or confidence that the police officer is going to be an asset or support community priorities. So we need to really own the history of policing in this country. We've been a little complacent, and some have been privileged, and kind of denial about some of the things that people of color have been going through as a result of over policing. So we need to accept this fundamental truth and really talk about and emphasize and make it part of curriculums and academies, etc., to let people know this is the story. That's the first thing we need to do, to tell the truth and put the truth out there, so it becomes undeniable in terms of why people feel the way they do. Second, we need to balance our law enforcement investments. We invest in crime detection, arrest, corrections. We need to counter that criminal justice culture that permits and sustains racial abuse up and down the system. Not only police, but correction, parole, probation, prosecutors, legislators. We spend billions continuing these policies. It costs $30,000 to $40,000 to incarcerate an individual on average in this country. But we don't have any money to really try to change lives and change patterns and change opportunities for people. So we need to take a look at where we're putting our money, time, and energy, and counter that with a culture that supports the things that we actually need. And lastly, we need bold legal and policy changes right throughout the system. Protests are important. They come toward the end of the racial continuum, after the fact, right? I'm not saying they're unimportant. They are. They create favorable conditions. It lets us have broader policy discussions. And of course, when there's disruptions, systems pay attention. But institutional change requires participation by everyone. We've seen what widespread participation and commitment to change can do. Charges are changed. People are, all kinds of progressive and appropriate criminal justice steps are taken when the people are on point and they're visibly taking actions to demanding change. That's pretty unusual in our country, especially when in regard to criminal justice agencies. We lay back and wait for a savior or someone who we think is more learned or courageous to fight our battles. So if you want to recruit, diversify your recruitment, you're going to have to first of all, get away from that enforcement perspective and start talking about service to the community. But I've been in policing for over 30 years. But even when I approach a police officer, I'm not quite sure of whether I'm going to get a friendly, accommodating posture or a defensive, non-trusting posture. And after a while, especially considering all the incidents that have occurred over the last years concerning people of color, it's not really an appealing profession for most folk, right? In order to change that, we're going to have to change our recruitment approach to service to the community, and not this super bad badass cop. We're gonna have to do something about these unarmed shootings and bad tactics where police overreach is so evident that it turns people off. This military appearance, now you can't separate the average cop from the Green Beret. It just in every instance now it's an overreach.
I want to try to make sure we get as many folks in this, because we got obviously we have a whole lot to cover.
Okay.
If you don't mind. So Chelsea,
sure.
So if just to piggyback on that, so Alan brought up the diversity part of recruiting. This is oftentimes pitched as a way to improve relations between minority communities, is to increase the diversity of the police forces. So what do you think about that? Does it work? Is that a solution that we need to be striving for?
Hi, thanks so much for that question. I actually completely disagree and think that we should be moving our money and time and energy into funding more community programs to create that diversity. I don't think we should put any more money into recruitment for police. I wouldn't want one extra police officer, whether he's white, black, brown, or anything. And I think that's the narrative strategy that we are getting caught up in from law enforcement that wants to keep us cycling, right? And you asked the question about that bad apple. Well, I would like to really point out to someone, if someone says, well, my brother, someone I know, someone that's a good cop, we need to redirect them to the institution of policing. Thank you, Alan, for bringing up the slave catcher history of policing. It was started in the UK to control crowds, just like right now, when they brought up in the national troops, that's why policing was started. They wanted an authority to settle crowds. Here on these lands, it was created for an authority to control crowds of who? Of enslaved Africans. So that's the history we're talking about. And for us to really unroot that, we need to stop talking about individuals and the right person is going to be the right guy to make the right relations, and understand that there will never be great relations with an institution that's rooted this way, and start to reallocate the resources to care rather than harm that will create better safety and responses for our individuals. Hold on. And then, and the other part that I want to just add to the piece of the narrative that we always need to be bringing back is budget. As I really loved what Alan was saying was, we need to change the culture, where I want to empower people to say, we need to take the money from the police budget to the community care budget. And that's what we need to be looking at, how to fund these programs. So when they're saying they don't know how, they don't need an extra tank, they don't need an extra police car. Like, these are the things of the budget lines of the police. That's what I want you to look at. Instead of individuals, new diversified individuals, I want you to look at the diversity of their budget.
Does anyone else want to weigh on that question? And also, if we could incorporate in your answer, there's been a push to make polygraphs one of the evaluating criteria for officers. So does everyone have any thoughts about how to integrate that into trying to figure out at least some basic questions, as far as like, have you been involved with any type of hate crimes? Are you a part of any type of hate groups? Because we see that coming up every now and again. We'll after you look back into this officer's history, you find out that, oh, he's also been associated with the Klan or with some other type of neo-Nazi organization. Is that a valid way to try to weed out some of these individuals who we don't need on the force?
I don't polygraphs would be as effective because they're not as scientifically reliable, being that it's dependent upon if someone is a narcissist or they don't have any conscience or empathy, you can pass a polygraph and that still will not reveal the truth about the heart or the intent of that individual.
I'll just say that, speaking of polygraphs and even voice stress analysis and all that stuff, it's always the contingent upon, in agreement with Latanya and Chelsea, the questions that you ask. So the questions that you ask are they're cookie cutter questions. That's one who's been through polygraphs for recruitment in the police department. They're not asking about hate crimes. They're not asking about when you those type of things. They're asking about, have you ever did drugs before, or do you promise to do the right thing on the street? I mean, those are cookie cutter questions, and if you ask the same cookie cutter questions to everybody, it does not weed out anybody, especially someone who's from a background that has no experience with diversity or so forth, and it kind of leaves you open to incidents like we're encountering right now. And then also with voice, stress analysis, and so forth, and nervous response systems, it's flawed in the sense that in those type of environments, you're being asked the question by the people who want to hire you. So there's not a civilian or someone who's detached from police work asking these questions and vetting you. There's someone who actually wants to hire you. So if I'm leaning more towards hire, I have a bias, and I'm going to be a lot more lenient in my review of sense.
And let me just say something really quickly, if I may. So while I absolutely heard the question, I think that's we're getting to a very granular and detailed level, and we're not there yet. There needs to be a fundamental commitment to justice, like Brian Stevenson said, right? And so when we talk about all of these solutions, and they're going to have to be very specific, but we're just not there yet. Because when we're talking about the overhaul of systems that Chelsea referred to, that means that, listen, a skill or will, a skill can be taught. Do you have the will? Do you have the desire to change this? That's a divine question. If not, we don't need you on the force. There's no need to go through the psychological and all those other things. If you don't have a commitment to justice, and by the way, we like to use the term evidence-based. Evidence is, there should be some sort of very tangible behavior that associates your said commitment to justice. So this is not arbitrary, but we have to start there first. We're talking really granular, and we're talking very specific, and we're just not there yet.
Okay, well, we are really behind on our time. And so I am going to kick this next question off, just kind of following in that same vein. Do you have the will to do right? Do you have the will to be racially equitable? And so there are so many trainings that are happening, right? Mandated racial and disability awareness training, instructed by outside organizations. The cadets get that training, and then it's implemented annually. Is it effective? And if it's not effective, what protocols should be implemented? And I'm taking this to LaTanya. Carol Adams is unfortunately unable to join us this evening. And so, Vernell, if you would like to also answer, that would be great. And Commonwealth Attorney Descano, please join in.
Yes, I feel police needs reoccurring training. They need training on cultural competency and being able to, the ability to understand and communicate effectively and interact with people across cultures. They need de-escalation tactics training. They need training around implicit biases, and it needs to be recurrent training. It can't be just one training and once you're completed, you're done and move forward. It needs to be recurrent training to reassess the officer's abilities, their will, if you say, because I feel like there's not enough oversight when it comes to training and being intentional about the training of an officer. It's like you go through all the tests at the beginning, you go through the basic training, and then you're given the gun, you're given the ability to take away somebody's liberty or their life. Those are two powerful entities that you have control over. So although I don't have all the answers in regards to that, I feel like it definitely needs cultural competency training, de-escalation tactics with the training. Even 100% of the police force need to be crisis intervention trained. I know that I work with some organizations out here that deal with the mental health community. And when you are dealing with the population of people that have been going under undue trauma, unaddressed trauma, and these individuals are living in communities that lack basic resources and access to things that can help alleviate that trauma, you're going to come into mental health situations of stress, anxiety, and high alert, and we already don't have the trust. So a lot of retraining, reoccurrent training, and cultural competency training needs to take place.
Well, I want to add to what she's saying, that needs to happen. I think too, what needs to happen is maybe looking at pulling outside resources. What happens?
I'm sorry, Vernell, you're digitizing. We're not able to understand you right now.
That you have, or two officers, or maybe a group who go to HR for. Can we now? Can you hear me now?
It kind of goes back and forth.
Alan, maybe you could jump in a little bit while Vernell switches position or something.
All the things you mentioned are important training issues that need to be addressed in policing, and some of them are. But training is has a limited effect, right? There's no enforcement of the standards that the training is supposed to implement. Then training occurs and it goes out the window. If you they train you how to do, excuse me. If you training is nice, but all those things. First of all, the standards of ability to really absorb all those kinds of high-level training probably don't exist in the majority of departments in this country. We have 18,000 law enforcement agencies in America. Most of them are less than 50 officers. Most of them probably education is a high school diploma, or maybe. So when you're talking about implicit and explicit biases and cross-cultural awareness, all these things, pretty sophisticated stuff. I don't know if the majority of officers in this country are really able to take on implementing those kinds of processes at a moment's notice, as an expert, right? I don't know. It's really.
Well, then what would you suggest then that they implement instead, quickly?
Well, first of all, establish standards, right? Standards that are accepted by the community, that are promoted by the community in conjunction with community consultation, and enforce those standards. Okay, these are the rules. When you break them, there's discipline involved. All right, without the discipline, the short-term answer to your question is establish standards that the community can support, and then enforce them with stark discipline. We haven't been doing that. Everything that we see occurring over the last years, very little repercussions occur due to officer behavior, right? So if nothing's going to happen, if I'm going to get away with it, this officer was showed a blatant disregard for any level of police professionalism, because I imagine he assumed he was going to be able to get away with it. So you can train all you want, but if there's no repercussions, if there's no fear that I'm going to be held accountable, then the training loses its effect.
Right. Steve Escano, can you jump in there? What are your thoughts?
Sure. I think training is vitally important, and I think that it is something that the community should be paying attention to, because not all training is created equally. For example, there is a private organization that trains police forces across the country that train the police to look at themselves as lions and the people in the neighborhood as lambs, or train them to take a more military footing. So the right kind of training is incredibly important. I also think it's interesting, and this goes back to what was talked about earlier, is, we are training these police to do so many different things. And an hour or a couple hours here on mental health or some of these other things, it's just not going to take. Individuals are going to fall back onto what they were trained on the most, which is, quite frankly, wearing a gun on their hip and running in with a badge and addressing a situation in that way. And it really goes to the point that we can train our officers, but we can't train them to do everything. And the idea that we should be spending some of our resources for things that are other than police officers, like social workers or mental health providers, would actually be useful, because those are the individuals who are trained to handle these types of situations that, unfortunately, because we expect our police force to do so much, that sometimes we send people who are not as equipped as they could be out into a situation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And, you know, to that very thing, we've got so many folks who are talking about the union, and they're absolutely right. You know, if they, the training, it is important. But if there are no consequences, no matter how well they've been trained, and they have a union that is going to constantly guard them from any repercussions, then all the training in the world isn't going to make bad actors act right. Kofi, let me toss it back to you.
Sure. So, can we talk a little about transparency? Whether it be the police or even the jails, there's just so much that isn't publicized. How do we get more transparency? Whether mandatory reporting, body cameras, whatever. There's a wide range of ways that we could try to improve transparency. But can we talk a little bit about that? Like, how do we get better insight as to what they're doing on a daily basis, on like data and things like that? Why isn't more of those things made public?
Well, most of that is due to the legislative actions, right? I mean, the laws protect police officers in terms of information. Some of it is legitimate, some of it is not. More importantly, though, we need to pay more attention to who our police managers and chiefs are. You know, we expect the guy on the ground to exhibit behaviors that the police managers and chiefs don't promote, right? So when police officers come into the job, they want to come in and do the best job that they can, generally, the average cop. When he gets into an institution that has other ideas, he has to change his focus if he wants to get promoted, if he wants to select it on a special assignment, if he wants to do well, if he wants to keep his job, then you have to fall in line with the status quo. So we get excited about who's running for mayor, but we don't hold that mayor accountable to who he appoints as the police chief. We don't hold that mayor accountable to other criminal justice actors that are appointed and who are going to have a big sway over our comings and goings. We don't. We complain, and the police, they do have unions, they do have sometimes the support of the mayor, but we should say, that person is not appropriate. That person doesn't have the background. That person exhibited behavior that we don't approve of. We've looked at some other candidates. Please look at them. And we have people in our community who's capable of being good police officers and good police managers. But we let the system do all the choosing, and we do all the complaining.
And I would just like to just interject really quickly. That's something, and those are things that we can achieve with some sort of strategy and maybe even long term. But today, right now, Steve, your peers on the force right now, you can actively challenge any behavior that you see that violates the rights of other citizens. You can have those courageous conversations, even though I think it's like long past time for courageous conversations. But how are we, I think the question then becomes, how are we personally making ourselves responsible for being a change agent, whatever our sphere of influence is? So while legislation is absolutely important and all of those things that we talked about, what about right now, today? Because Black lives are at risk every single time we walk outside the door. So it does require a sense of urgency. Whatever our response is, it requires a sense of urgency. So like, Steve, like, how can you change the culture today? Steve, what kind of conversations can you have with your peers today? And I think those are the things that we need to be talking about imminently, like right now, and then we can strategize for the future.
Yes.
That's good. I'm going to focus real quick on the side of transparency. Can you guys hear me better now? I switched.
Yes.
Okay, great. Every tool that we have, all the tools that you got, some of my body cameras and all this stuff and other equipment like that are great equipment, but the equipment is only as good as the user and the transparency of the users that have been using it, if that makes sense. The problem is that I feel that we have a lack of involvement from the public eye or the civilian side of the house handling those type of investigations. And most of these times you have your internal affairs investigation, it's done by people in the house, or it's all dependent upon the officer that's being investigated by, which officer, which detective, or who's and so from my experience, depending on who's investigating it and who they are investigating, that things can slip through the cracks. I'm not going to say any way that people do that, but it does happen on purposely, and sometimes it happens omittingly. But I think that more people inside on the inside that are not police being in conjunction with police. I think, you know, my dad used to say, keep honest people honest. And I always love that. You know, we keep honest people honest by putting things in place by saying, hey, there's civilians that are trained in these in investigations to assist in these investigations. That way it keeps honest people honest.
So there are some ways that people can do things right now, right? I really like what Lorraine was saying, like we need to do things right now. Some of those things that I would like to see right now is a transparency around the many grievances of certain police officers. There are right here in Richmond, Virginia, where I am. There are certain places, especially in certain public housing courts, that have the same officers. Sorry, I think I went out for a second. That have the same officers, have so many complaints and grievances against them. And now is the time to be transparent that we could fire them today. We have right here last year, 2 officers that went and told middle school students, I wait till your ass is mine when you're 18. We could release the names of that officer and fire them right now. These are the ways that we can get justice and more trust in the community right now. We just got everyone was that was out protesting, that was tear gassed, that was escorted to the monuments, surrounded, and then tear gassed. We could have that investigation and not just say that we're disciplinary action. We can say what that disciplinary action is, because what I'm hearing is a lot of transfer. Just this is why I talk about the money, y'all. They're talking about disciplinary action is now also going to include mental health support for police. That's the narrative that's now coming, from these last couple of days of what they want to do with mental health for all, including the police. So this is what, and also something else, if we're talking about transparency here, I'd like to just lift a little bit that's not right now, but people can follow, is predictive policing. We right now are trying to track our data, and Richmond Police went and got a new system known for predictive policing that will absolutely cause more biases and where police are dispatched and over policing. So I just wanted to put those 2 points out there of like, there are things right now that include firing cops that many of the grievances are out there and listening to people. That's the best way for transparency, not on numbers, not on your data. Go and say, I hear you, I'm listening, they're gone.
Right. Very well said, Chelsea, very well said.
If I could just provide a little bit of commentary. I'm sorry, were you about to, before we move off of the transparency a little bit, I think, you know, there were two points brought up. So I know a lot of times there's a lot of pushback, even from within people who want to see better policing against body cameras. Because people say, look, you know, we don't need to give any more money. But if I may, like, if we're going to cut funding from the police, I would rather we focus on things that do not, I'd rather we not cut from the areas that will actually help us with the transparency. And as far as the policy, having been actually participated in helping to write the Fairfax County policy, I understand that it's not the camera. These officers don't just arbitrarily do whatever they want with the cameras. It's really written, there's codes and policies and guidelines that are written as to how they can operate those cameras. And unless you actually see those, and if actually those things are publicized, and if you actually try to play a role and play a part in trying to shape that policy, then they're going to write their policy the way they want to write it, and they're going to release the videos if they want to release it, and they're going to cut it off whenever they want to cut it off. But you have to be able to then take the extra step to then find out what does their policy say if we're going to, you know, before we start saying we just don't want cameras at all, because there's no point. And also the transparency issue, like, we also got to make sure that we show up to these like public safety meetings, We got to make sure that we actually ask the questions. Sometimes we're asking questions and information is readily available, but we're not really asking the questions. Like, we're talking to each other, but we're not talking to the right people. You know, we're not actually asking the county for some information. And I know that probably doesn't pertain to a lot of people on this panel here per se, because you do a lot of the hard work, but I guarantee you a lot of the people out there who, you know, I know I talked to several people who, you know, they're upset about the police, but they don't even know who the police chief is, you know? So
Yeah.
if you don't even know who that person is, then clearly you haven't actually emailed him or contacted his office to try to find out, you know, any questions. So that's not to, you know, knock anything, but we also have to make sure we're doing our part to force that transparency.
Yeah, I wanna push back on this a little bit, because I think it's important to realize the fear that the institution of police have done. We now in Richmond at Richmond Transparency and Accountability Act have started our own hotline because most people don't want to reach out to their police. Like, nobody wants to go and find out more of their police officer. And I would really love to encourage us to talk better about how the misinformation, the reallocation of information is part of the inequity. So people not knowing, that's not their fault. And I don't want to put anyone down for that. And I think it's more important that it goes back to, if someone is telling you that they're feeling overforced and over policed, I don't care if they know their police chief or not, I believe them. I don't care if they know the numbers, I believe them. And it's important for us to now guide that experience in and let them know who the police chief is or not. But I think it's important for our narrative when we go out there to also understand the literally 400 years of institutional racism we talked about. We have to understand that's what people are dealing with every day and what we're asking them to interact with as well. So I just wanted to lift that a little bit. I think it's important for this education piece, but it's also really important how we narrate that.
If I may, just for a minute to just quickly add, I think it's not only, I know people like to say data, right? And if we want institutional equitable change, it's not just about data, it's about the right data, right? So when we think about numbers and race and ethnicity being added, making sure those numbers are accurate, right? And then on top of that, what we can do right now is also asking for those policies to be transparent. I just want to plug in there that, you know, right now, we're demanding that the rights of protesters be respected and protected, and that police officers do not abuse their powers, right? There has been continued unnecessary use of force. And I just want to say we are watching and asking for those policies to be first transparent, and then working on making use of force and what that looks like, and working with community members to what that acceptable policy looks like is the next step. So today we can ask for transparency, and we can ask right now that, you know, the use of force that they are currently using is unjustified and that folks are watching, and civil rights are being violated everywhere. And, you know, when we're protesting for Black communities and Black lives, at the end of the day, you know, we need to make sure that this is not just resulting, which is what I've seen from videos, is just redoing that system, right? We're seeing Black people getting locked up who are protesting for their rights unnecessarily so. So, you know, people who are putting curfews, please, 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 you know, we're talking, hold your decision makers accountable, and we're really watching. So I know that the Richmond Transparency Project and a lot of community organizations are really out there and collecting data, but I don't want this to become another thing where, like, hey, we passed this bill and we've got the data. It's about the right data and transparency about the policies that they have in place now.
Right, right. Thank you for that, Ashna. And you know what? That is a perfect segue, because we have talked about all of the ways that we want police to be transparent. We've talked about all of the ways that we want data, and we want the right data. But once we get it, we've got to do something with it. And that means that we get to then hold police accountable. So let's transition on into that conversation. And, you know, there's a lot of conversation right now about the civilian review panels or the civilian review boards, getting those instituted. Right now in Virginia, there are only 2. Isn't that something? There are only 2 civilian review panels, and I would dare say that they don't even really have teeth to them. You know, if someone contacted me today and they said, well, you know, they're talking about the chief of police will be able to appoint individuals to the civilian review panel. That's a problem. So I'm going to pose this question to you, to Ashna, and to Alan, and to Steve and Chelsea. I'm going to draw you into that question because this is the place where you are working very hard right now. So first of all, let's talk about what a civilian review panel does. And we're not going to talk about it in the context of the way that they're trying to frame it for us now. We're going to talk about it in the context of what it needs to be, because that's the framing that we need to advance and fight for. Go ahead, Steve.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I'm happy to talk about civilian review panels because I was on the Fairfax County Civilian Review Panel, one of the two in the state. And, our civilian review panel in Fairfax County is very, very limited. And I would agree with you that it is not necessarily an institution that you would call having teeth. Essentially, what the Fairfax County Review Panel does is that it reviews internal affairs investigations for completeness if the individual who made the complaint is unhappy. Now, that is one method. If you take a look at around the country, other civilian review panels that are more, that are stronger and that do more and that actually are more of a part of their community, one of the things that you notice is that they have independent investigatory authority. They have the ability to ask questions. But what really makes them go, besides having that power, is they have professionalized, full-time, dedicated staff. What it is right now, Fairfax County, these are 9 individuals who volunteer their time. And what that means is that there's not a professionalized staff to get things done quickly, to get things done completely. And also, quite frankly, it hurts the makeup of the panel because the people who are on the panel are retired or individuals who are working class who can afford to take off a lot of time for work. For example, when I was on the panel, there were 9 of us. 5 of us were attorneys and 3 of the remaining individuals were retired. And while we were all, I think, great people, we had our hearts in the right places, that by no means was representative of the community at large.
Thank you for that. And you
Can I
know,
ask
you
a
raised an
question?
important point there. Sure.
Does the Fairfax Civilian Review Board have the power to subpoena?
It does not.
Okay.
Well,
Is
there's
that
no
something
teeth in any
that
of
I
it.
would consider? Is it something
Go ahead,
that you
LaShawn.
would consider?
I'm sorry?
Is it something that you all will consider?
Oh, I'm not on the panel anymore.
Oh,
I had to get off the panel to run for Commonwealth's attorney, but I know that the panel intimately because I was the NAACP representative. I helped write the initial bylaws, but we were completely limited by what the enacting legislation was. Quite frankly, we were even limited in the questions that we were able to ask. And while I will give Fairfax County credit for making the entire internal affairs investigative file available to the members of the Civilian Review Panel, which is a great step, there are so many other steps that the panel could take or more powers that the panel could be given to actually make it able to fulfill its mission of independent review.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you.
I like to, just to build off of what Latanya and Steve said, it has no teeth, right? And so the fix is statewide legislation. And so this is where I make the plug of we need to call for a special session for passing legislation specifically for policing right now. And we need to do that because the only way to do that is erasing state limits on civilian review boards. And that's the only way to give them more power. That means that it would require approval for, when they're using military equipment, surveillance technology. It would also empower them to look into police misconduct and have the power to subpoena, which doesn't happen right now. So that's statewide legislation and that needs to be passed because we're seeing that right now we're asking for all mayors and all communities to put on these civilian review boards, but we also need to make sure that 1, they have the power to do what is needed to hold police officers accountable. And then 2, kind of like Steve said, we need community members. We can't just, the process of who is serving on there, how they are picked, how they are compensated. That is so incredibly important. And have it be leaders who have the best values and they know what's right for their own community. And they need to be empowered. They need to be, on the board and they need to be there. And so I know that I see Chelsea and Latanya like nodding their heads, like that's where it needs to be at. And so, you know, I know Chelsea, you might have something to say. You can put it in now because that is equally important. We just don't want these things to be just like policies, like a check on the box. We're tired of that. We're done with that. It needs to be real power, real teeth, real accountability. And so, you know, there's a lot of pieces of legislation that need to be passed right now, like decertification, misconduct, police misconduct right now. If you are, you know, investigated or anything, you can be let go of a police force and then serve as a police officer in another community. And so we need to do decertification in Virginia. I believe there was an article and we had like a grade F. We are one of the worst states when it comes to decertification and police accountability when it comes to that. So those are some key legislative pieces that can be passed now. And that means that Eileen Fillercorn needs to make sure that the special session, the content is policing. We need that right now.
That's right. I just want to make one point. So we have Delegate Kay Corey on the line, who just made a really relevant point. We just passed the Community Policing Act, which requires data collection on each complaint about excessive force. Now imagine that we couple that with a community review board that's actually got some teeth to it and is able to make recommendations regarding what discipline could look like, because they have now, you know, they have been trained and they understand this process, and we actually have the teeth in our community review board that those are actually followed. So, I mean, you're absolutely right, Ashna. It's time for a special session. And now that we have this data, it must be collected. We need to have the teeth to be able to do something with it. Chelsea, please, we'd love to hear from you. You know, Steve, you are also on this question. So what do you have to say here?
I'm struggling. I keep coming. I'm sorry, for whatever reason, I was having trouble with my audio there. But no, I think that's incredibly right. It is. I think kind of what you've hit upon is something that is a truth here, is that there is no silver bullet. There are a number of problems, a number of issues that need to be addressed from a variety of different ways. And it's the synergy of many things coming together that is actually going to really make change. Because to your point, data is great, and we need more data. But if data just sits in a closet or sits in the dark and nobody sees anything, it's not going to do anything. So all of those things, the call for legislative action as well, and action at the local level, I think it's vitally important that we remember that it's not just one thing; it is a collection of things that have to be done to be effective.
I agree, Steve, and I'm gonna say one more thing. So going back to my sense of urgency, right? And so we're really talking about, at the root of all of this, equal protection under the law. So we have existing laws that are in place right now that Black people are not afforded the ability to, so what we're saying is we're not even making it to the courthouse in order for there to be a preponderance of the evidence. We're not making it past an initial police contact. So when we say equal protection under the law, the review board is down the line. Right now, we can't even get in handcuffs and make it to the jail safely. Cart before the horse. So I'm just saying we have to have some fundamental discussions about what are we really talking about here? Because when I talk about commitment to justice, this is that is you is or is you ain't moment, right? Tom and Jerry, is you is or is you ain't? What side are you on? And it's not black and white. It is, are you on the side of justice or are you not? Because when a Black body is laying in the street, I need to know that you're going to say something. I'm going to need to know that you're going to stand up for what is right in that moment. And so the fact that Black people right now do not have equal protection under the law, and let's call it what it is, we need to be much more responsible and intentional about our narrative. Let's stop saying this is frustrating. Let's not say this is a shame. This is a crime. This is a crime. And so we need to, again, be very intentional. That's part of the way that we can exercise our activism, making sure we're calling out structural institutional racism and bias every single time we see it.
And Lorena, if I might say, I have to say, you're absolutely right. I think it's Not only do you have the urgency, but I think while all these individual pieces are important, I think that you're right that we can't lose the forest for the trees, and we have to realize that we are in a moral moment, and that what is going to move us forward is a commitment to justice and a real commitment to community and really and the right values going forward. So these individual pieces are important, but you are right that they fall apart without that commitment to justice really being systemically ingrained in all of our criminal justice system, as well as all of our community and society.
Yeah, I just like to speak about the accountability piece. I like to talk about the accountability piece. It's nice and it's appropriate to talk about accountability from our local police, which we need. But accountability really goes much higher than that, right? Police do what they're told, right? The police culture only changed when the old practices are no longer rewarded, right, or respected in an organization, and the management holds staff accountable for the new standards of accountability. So we need to reach, police chiefs, prosecutors, command staff, mayors, legislative bodies. Those are the people who can actually change laws and change policies and make it so that the police have to obey the laws that they've now been given. We need to know exactly what we want. We need to utilize the expertise that we have in our own communities to decide what's best for us, and then present those kind of findings to folk who are in a position to change things.
Thank you for that, Alan. You're absolutely right. And, we have had this conversation we began with at the front door when we've got these officers that are wanting to come in, that are wanting to join the force, and how do we make sure that we're picking the right ones? And then, once we've got them in, how do we make sure that they're trained appropriately? And then how do we make sure that what they're doing, we're able to oversee it and understand what's going on? And then now we've just talked a little bit about accountability, but there's another part of accountability, right? Now we've got that body laying in the street, and we have recognized that it has that something is incredibly criminal about what has happened here in this moment. There's a problem when it ends up in the prosecutor's office, unfortunately, 90% of the time. You know what, let me not throw out statistics that I cannot back up, but it is increasingly harder. It is incredibly hard to ever find prosecution that really does bring about justice. Help us understand, Steve.
Well, I think there's really two reasons, I think, for that. The first one is the legal reason, right? Quite frankly, officers, by Supreme Court precedent, they have the ability to justify their actions more than a normal citizen would. And that is completely Supreme Court made, and that needs to, quite frankly, go away because it protects bad officers who do bad things and helps perpetuate a culture of violence towards individuals that officers are meant to protect and serve. But that is not the only problem here. There is another problem where prosecutors simply do not have the will or the desire to prosecute these cases. And a lot of times while the legal issue is a legitimate issue, there are many prosecutors who will look at that and use that as an excuse to not fulfill their duties. And if they don't use that as an excuse explicitly, they do it implicitly. And what I mean by that is they take a look at that case differently than they would if someone else was the possible defendant. And what I mean by that is they go into this review looking for every single possible reason to justify why an officer did an action, as opposed to going into it with an unbiased and actually looking at the facts. So yes, there is a legal impediment to charging and convicting officers. I do not want to undersell that because that is legitimate and that does need to be fixed. But I do think a huge problem of it is just the culture of prosecutors' offices who do not realize that their job is to serve the people and to protect the people's interests, not the interest of an individual officer that will come across their case or come across their desk.
Thank you for that. Anyone else want to chime in on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, if I may add, again, it's going back to values, right? And so we got to talk about who is in office, what are their values, and then it's also about relationships. A lot of times prosecutors have relationships with the sheriffs and the police officers And they work with them a lot of the times as well. And so we need an independent overview to investigate to hold police responsible for any excessive use of force. And these need to be independent investigators and prosecutors that are full-time looking into this and looking into prosecuting cases of police brutality and excessive uses of force. And so this needs to either live in the AG's office or IG, but it needs to be separate. We cannot continue with the way the system is. It cannot continue that way. And then the second thing is then again, back to values, right? So who are our prosecutors? We elect them here in Virginia. So they hold a lot of power all the way from what charges to bring forth and make recommendations. And so at the end of the day, it really comes about to values, who you're for, who we elect, and then also we just need an independent body. It cannot continue the way it has been.
Okay. Thank you so much for that. So, I think Kofi, I'm going to kick it back to you because we've got to keep it moving, and I really want us to get to, actually, you know what, Lorraine, I'm going to toss it to you to get some of those questions that are being asked on Facebook. Let's get them on.
I wish I had some questions. I've actually put in a couple of asks, and no one has dropped any questions in the chat. So I will ask again publicly. If anyone has any questions that they want to ask the panel, anyone on the panel, please feel free to drop it in the chat and I'll make sure it gets heard. But I don't want to waste time with that. So go ahead, back to you, Valerie. And I actually saw there were quite a few great questions in the chat on Zoom. So let's get back to that and I'll let you know.
Right. Perfect. Kofi, I'm going to toss it to you. And, I've been typing in some answers. Somebody asked about the...
Can I pose a question?
Sure. I just wanted to let someone know that they had asked about the citation in the Constitution that grants qualified immunity. And I wanted you to know that I did put that in there. If you want to know, it's in the chat. Go ahead, LaTanya.
Chelsea, this question is for you with the Civilian Review Board, and being that it's only two, and Steve, two in the state of Virginia, how does the average citizen get started in creating one in their locale?
That's a really great question. So here in Richmond, we've been able to work with our local Legal Aid Justice Center, and we are working now to support other counties on how to do that and question that process. So everyone has kind of heard about Richmond's, and I want to be very, very clear what we are doing. That there, it's interesting that everyone's signed on, but our process is there has with the family that was impacted, Marcus David Peters, the organizers, but also the community. We can't put together a civilian review board without a process from the community of input, what we want on that board. And so we want to take this model and give it to other counties. And so we're working on something like that to be able to show people from Virginia, because will be statewide legislation. Hopefully, Ashna, thank you for bringing that up, that this special session should also really include policing. And we know Senator Hashmi and Senator McClellan are also working on legislation. So if we had the statewide support, this way, if we give out this information to counties all over that way you can work on that. But I would say definitely link up with Legal Aid Justice Center. If there are definitely people in your community doing it, just start getting email addresses and being in community together so that information can flow. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
So we did have a few questions that popped up in the chat that Shreem is gonna toss out there right now.
All right. Hi, everybody. First question is, how do you feel about SROs in schools? If there are no SROs, what can schools do to implement a safety plan?
So I like was said, I recently graduated, but in my school, there was an influx of SROs because of the population that my school serves. There was an influx of firearms being found on students at my school, not because they were going to be used to commit acts of violence within the school, but they were protection for the kids before they actually boarded the school bus and after they unloaded on the school bus for protection within their community. So we were put under the use of metal detectors. So on random days, they would have us stand out. Usually when it was really cold, they would have us all unload off the bus and stand outside, and we would have to individually be checked before we got into school. They use SROs for suspensions and to break up fights. So it left a lot of kids being brought out in handcuffs off of minor usual teenage altercations. So SROs, in the sense of my environment and my school, only led to an increase of trauma within an already traumatized school system. There were a lot of incidents that weren't needed to be handled by police officers that were handled by police officers because they were put there instead of like a counselor or a mentor or something like that. It was police, like it was like an automatic pipeline to prison within the actual walls of the school. So instead of using SROs in the school environment, I feel like there should be more counselors, people who are trained to diffuse the situation mentally, because a lot of the physical altercations that go on in school come from mental disturbances within the child themselves. So that's my take on SROs.
Baby girl, I want to so commend you and endorse that like 200 times, as you said it so very well. But there is actual documented data that says police in schools do not make schools safer. So we want to make sure, while we're being evidence-based, we bring in all of the data that says schools with SROs don't necessarily, not only do they not necessarily make them more safe, but they also increase the probability of engagement with law enforcement for already marginalized communities. And so again, guys, you know, we don't need any more Black youth coming in contact with the police officers for reasons that we just saw, or we continue to see. So what we're saying is, if we can build community schools, right, and we can figure out how to have this synergy, and we look out for and protect each other and not be afraid. And again, this is also what it's about, not being afraid to call your neighbor or walk to your neighbor's house and say, you know what, that wasn't cool, but listen, baby girl, let me tell you what you can do. This is how I can support you, instead of being judgmental. So we absolutely can help. We absolutely can be a resource, but we just have to make that decision first. So thank you for bringing that up. And last thing I'm going to say on this topic is, listen, movements are most effective when they're led by those that are impacted by the issues. And so I so appreciate that when that question was posed, baby girl, you came out and you shared your perspective, because it's very important for your narrative to be heard in your way. So thank you.
Vernell, can you weigh in on that?
Well, you know, I can only go by what I've experienced as being an SRO. I was an SRO for over the past 10 years. I think it all goes into who's going into schools. I mean, you also have within the schools, you have security officers as well, and they're trained in conjunction with police officers. And it goes to the officers that are in the schools, who's in there, and how. And you know how they're vetted when they're going to schools, and I think that process definitely needs to be better. There have been SROs that came to the school, and it was until they had an incident that they realized that, okay, he was not the best fit to be working with youth, and so that it's more or less the vetting process. I've seen SROs who actually had the youth interest in mind, and we went to more of a because I was on the board for actually. How SROs could be better in schools with the school board in Newport News. And we went more to hey, let's talk about educating our youth, and let's talk about coming in alongside with counselors. We actually did to talk about those experiences and help them to see the side of police that educates them and wants to have their best interests. I can talk about personal encounters of kids who explain to me that, hey, I am scared for my life when I leave and go to school, but that's not every case, and it's not in every school, and you know, there's no cookie cutter way to do it. But I think that the officers have to be vetted more and be placed in upon being seen and deemed as someone who can actually work with youth and realize, like this young lady so well and eloquently spoke, that they're not being traumatized in the school. They need to know that, hey, I am there for you. I'm here to assist you. I want to educate you and I want to help you. You know, and I want to be a part of your education just as much as I am a law enforcement officer. That doesn't always happen.
So if I could just,
I'm going to chime in on that also, only because I was made aware that that the Department of Justice has just granted nearly $400 million in grant funding to different states to increase their law enforcement hiring. $400 million. And Virginia is on the list of grantees, just so you know. In Virginia, the counties that received, the jurisdictions that received money are Chesterfield County. They received $1,875,000. Lynchburg received $250,000. Manassas received $250,000. Page County received almost $500,000. Harrisburg received $125,000. Stafford received $750,000. Westmoreland received $500,000. So there is a response happening to what's going on right now, and it is to arm up more police officers. And so while we're talking about SROs in school and they are talking about more money to fund police, we need to be very well aware of what's going on. I'll drop this link in the chat so that everyone can check this out for themselves. But yeah, we need to get police out of school. We heard this young lady already say that we need counselors and we need all of the support staff to support young people that are coming out of traumatized situations and home and community lives. And so we have a very different narrative that's happening at the national level, at the federal level. And so money is being dispersed. We cannot be blind. We cannot, while we're having this conversation, we need to make sure that we are doing something, that we're putting into place the hard stops to keep more police out of schools.
Okay, and to that point, what I want, and thank you so much for bringing that up. What I wanted to say is something that I would like to, that a lot of our collective minds have put up at the state level, is that what's happening is that the Attorney General's office can apply for these federal grants without localities' input or even permission. So localities don't even have to ask for it or anything. What we would like to see is a state legislative bill that would require the locality, that the Attorney General would have to have locality permission in order to apply for a grant to increase their police budgeting. Because that way, even if they get it, it can't come into their city. And that's how we protect ourselves. And to what Valerie's talking about, because right now the AG's office can just apply for all that money. And you know that that's exactly what they're doing right now.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, somebody have something else?
No, I was just going to say that we have a Facebook question. So Kalia Harris asks, how can we encourage our peers to advocate for these demands? Whoever wants to get that. How can we encourage our peers to advocate for these demands?
First of all, I think we need to really decide what our priorities are. We need to put them out there, write them down, get them documented, and share them with the community so the community actually knows exactly what we're talking about and what the pros and cons are, what the benefits are to adopting whatever program that we think are effective. And if people don't generally know what's going on in government, someone has to tell them. And those of us with the expertise and the wherewithal to be able to get that information, we need to make the information available to the public so they can make intelligent decisions.
That's exactly right.
I agree with that.
Go ahead, Tanya. Oh, you just wanted to agree or you want to chime in?
No, I was going to say I agree with that because like Valerie mentioned, I do an education to action workshop during the summertime when school lets out, primarily because that's the best time to reach the younger people when they're out of school. But with that being said, information is power, knowledge is power. So if we can, as leaders, get together, like Alan stated, organize the message, get the talking points together, get those anecdotal stories and testimonies together, build new leaders to come forward. Like, we just need to start a good assembly line and a production of new leaders coming in. You come in without the knowledge, you leave with the knowledge. You come in without, we equip you with the tools. So it's just basic organizing, like the grassroots, deep down civil rights type, not everything on social media, just being tangible and reaching people and just pulling them in. Because a lot of people don't know, and it's no fault to their own. We've been living in racist, systemic, oppressive constructs for a very long time, my entire life. I'm 42. And the lack of knowledge shouldn't be the burden of the individual that doesn't know. We need to make sure we reach down and pull up. And then once we pull them up, we organize. And once we organize, we mobilize. And then once we mobilize, we can create that sustainable change that we need.
That's what's up, LaTanya. I love it. And Kofi, I actually would like to hear from you, simply because the name of your organization is the Activated People, right? So activating people and inspiring movements, exactly how you getting that done. So I think that would also speak to Kalia's question.
Yeah, well, so I wanted to talk a little bit about the SRO policies a little bit. I guess I'm more of a nerd in a sense. I like digging through the policies, digging through the data, and I found a lot of value in doing that. That's why I kind of like to focus on that. So with the SRO policies, for instance, so a couple years ago, we went back. The Fairfax Police had intentions of actually expanding their SRO program from high school and middle school down to elementary school. And so they kind of came to us and said, hey, look, what's going on? What do you think about this, basically? So that got the wheels turned, and we started looking into it and trying to figure out, well, what exactly are the SROs doing in the schools? Turns out that about 65% of the kids that they were arresting were African-American and Latino, right? That's only about 30% of the population, but 60% of the kids are being arrested. So that lets even more digging to try to figure out, well, why is that, right? So we went back and we saw, well, most of these arrests were things like grand larceny, assaults, disorderly conduct, which basically, a middle school with a disorderly conduct charge, that's basically acting up, right? So the problem, in my opinion, was that it was written into the policy that the SROs could basically do whatever they want, because the very first paragraph of the SRO Memorandum of Understanding said that officers were administrators, right? So the problem with that is that it gave the officers the ability to act like they were teachers, and that basically circumvented the constitution rights of the students. So now they couldn't didn't have to have their rights read to them. The officers could do search and seizures whenever they wanted to. It was written into the policy that they were allowed to do stop and frisk. It said one of the reasons that they were one of their missions was to monitor cultural influences. That's an actual quote inside of written into the policy. So if you're monitoring cultural influences and doing stop and frisk, you're essentially racially profiling and being able to act on it, and it's written down in the policy, right? So that's how they're trained. That's how they're taught to train, right? So the students didn't have any rights. The parents didn't have any rights. Parents didn't have to know if their kids were being spoken to, challenged, searched, or anything, right? So the way we went about doing it, to get to the question of how do we move from here, is that we formed a coalition. We talked to the teachers unions, we talked to the PTAs, we got them on board. We got other activist organizations on board. We basically formed a coalition of about 15 different organizations. ACLU People Power was a great help as well. And so with that, we were able to change the entire policies and draw a distinct line between what's disciplinary action versus what's a crime. And officers, it's said in there, are not allowed to get involved with anything that's disciplinary, right? 6 months later, there was a 60% reduction in the number of kids that were getting arrested, right? So that was about 200 less kids that got arrested because of the changes that were made. And those are the types of things. So we then tried to push that up to the state. There were several bills that were pushed up over the last couple of years to mandate that, and also to mandate the training piece to that to accompany those efforts. All right, so they're now required to have mandatory training with between the teachers, the administrators, and the police and the SROs every year to make sure that you institutionalize that cultural change. So that's just one example, just kind of piggyback on some of the things. It's not just about figuring out that apple. You got to be able to do the heavy lifting and the hard work behind it.
I wanted to also quickly add, a lot of the decision makers are elected, right? And they're elected for you all, by you all. And so, you know, a couple things is one, contacting your legislators and asking for that special session, right? I want statewide, you know, the criminal legal system is such that it's so complicated, it's working the way it is, right? We need state level, local level, and national working together to dismantle the systems. And so asking your legislators to call in a special session so we can do some of the things that we talked about today would be one thing. The other is working, you know, with civilian review boards and in the way that Chelsea and contacting Legal Aid Justice Center and asking mayors to really go in that direction, right? And making sure that community engagement is from step one. The third way is, you know, I also want to recognize we're in the middle of a health pandemic, right? And so, you know, we didn't really talk about the folks that are currently behind bars. And so I know that there's a lot of prosecutors, Steve included, and I'd urge Steve to talk about this, who has reduced their jail populations by a huge percentage. A lot of Virginia jails have a lot of pretrial population, a lot of people who haven't, you know, don't need to be there. And same thing with, we've been urging the governor to use his clemency powers to let people out in prisons, especially during this, you know, time of crisis. And so Steve's done a great job, Parissa, Buddha, there are people who are working to really decarcerate in the midst of this health crisis. And then we're asking that police officers and asking your sheriffs to not incarcerate, you know, unnecessary interactions, especially during this time. Because really what it talks about is the health and well-being of Black people and community of colors. And right now that's not being really prioritized.
So I know we're nearing the end. I really appreciate everyone's time and willingness to dig into these issues here. I wanted to toss out one final question to the entire panel. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about what's going to happen in the future over these next couple of months, based on what you're seeing, and if, you know, why or why not?
Well, I'm a little pessimistic. I'd love to be optimistic, but I've seen these things happen before. We've had similar, throughout the decade, we've had people who stood up and spoke out, but eventually the system applied pressure and people back off and they stop. So, and one of the reasons for that is we need to really articulately prepare. There are many agencies out there with the independent agencies with the expertise to give us the information that we want. So we don't necessarily have to depend on the public sector. So I'm a little pessimistic. I hope things get better. I hope things change, but history tells us it's going to take intense participation by everybody, but all right-minded thinking people to be successful. And typically people get excited and then they diminish.
I'm optimistic. I've always been an optimist, but I'm optimistic for the future, just simply because we've had a shift in leadership. So it's a lot of people who are engaged, who can teach people like me and the generations coming up the importance of voting, the importance of knowing that anybody with the right mindset, with the right intent, and with the right end goals can run for these higher offices. Like, it's not just institutionalized on who can run. And so I feel like if we have the ability to mobilize and garner this new generation, we could cause a shift that could change something. It doesn't have to be something huge, but it could change something that could be a catalyst to further change. So I'm optimistic just for the fact that we have leaders that can mold this future generation into something new.
And I'm optimistic because I mentor leaders like her and I raise them. So I feel like we have a powerful generation in Generation Z. And not only that, we are working, well, I can only speak for my community. I know boots on the ground, our elders, our youth, the adults that's currently doing the work, we're more intersected and we're more engaged together. So we're getting the history, we're seeing the vision of the future, and we're dealing with the now. So I'm optimistic. I want to capitalize off this energy, off this momentum. And while everybody is, like Lorraine kept stating, we need to get to the action right now, because that is one thing that constantly happens. We get upset, we get enraged, we get this energy going, and then the conversations happen, and then it fades to black. I just want to put love as a verb. So I just want to put all this talk to action, and I'm ready to work. We have some young people that's ready to work. We're going to be getting to work in Newport News, and if everybody do everything they're supposed to do in their localities, we can organize this and get it done.
That's right.
Oh my goodness, that is exactly right. It is time to get to work. And with that, you know, here we are. We have come to the end of our time this evening, and it is time for the call to action. It's time to say that's exactly right. It's time to get to work. And so all that we have talked about this evening, we have put together a petition that allows us to collect all of these amazing ideas, but to do something with them. We've heard talk about how is it that we are able to kick off a civilian review panel? How do you start that work? And so what I would like for you all to do is to please click that link and take that survey so that we can find out exactly in what jurisdiction we have activated people that are willing to take the lead on building these civilian review boards. You heard from Chelsea that the Legal Aid Justice Center is there to help in formatting them. You can also reach out to the activated people because, like Kofi and like Steve shared, there is one in Fairfax already. So we don't have to invent a wheel here. It's time to take what we already have and make it much better than it is, but let's not be settling for better. Let's get to best. And so take that survey and activate your community and make sure that we get civilian review boards everywhere. When special session comes up, you make sure that you are contacting, as we're preparing for it, you make sure that you contact Speaker Fillercorn and let her know that police reform has got to be a part of the conversation. And specifically, we've got to make sure that these community review boards, or these community review panels, that it is legislated that they must be everywhere. And then you make sure that you're also contacting your local and state elected officials and demand that they are a part of the implementation of civilian review panels. Make sure that they are looking for transparency and robust vetting of the trainees that are coming in. You know, one thing I wanted to lift up, when I became an attorney, they made me pay for a character and fitness check. And it was not a cheap thing, but they raked through my past. And if there was anything there that they found at all questionable, they had me then answer to a panel. They have potential attorneys answer to a panel. We need to make sure that the way that we are vetting the potential police officers is such that we are holding them accountable even before they get the badge, that we are demanding a level of transparency and a level of commitment to racial equity and no more of what we have been seeing that we have yet to see in this time. So these are some calls to action that we have put together, and we're asking each and every one of you to, like I said, complete that petition, call Speaker Fillercorn, make sure that we are implementing civilian review panel, first of all, in our legislation, and then get to work to make sure that it's happening in your jurisdiction. And so with that, we want to thank each and every one of you for joining us tonight. Thank you for being a part of this conversation. We need for you to absolutely get to work. I have put up everyone who is here, their information has been made available to you. And even now, more information is being placed and being made available. So avail yourself to all of those who know what they're doing, who have already done it, who are a part of process. Not a one of us is in this alone. No jurisdiction that has it right, and no jurisdiction that's trying should be alone as they are fighting to get it done. We must be a united people. We must be an activated people. We must be a people that will not stop until we realize the change that we are fighting for. With that, I want to tell you all good night, and I want to thank y'all for being here.
Night,
God
everyone.
bless. Take care.
Night, everyone. Thank
All
you.
right, thank you so much.
Night.
Night.
God bless you all.
Sending everyone peace and love during this time. Take
Peace
care.
and love.
See you guys
Thank
later.
you, panelists. You were amazing. Every one of you, you were amazing. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie.
Just that thing.